The first time I saw her, the wind had a hiss to it that made the mesquite along US 287 sound like it was whispering. I'd been driving since Amarillo, eyes going gummy. That no man's hour when the radio becomes one voice and the world feels uninhabited. The rest stop between Henrietta and Wichita Falls slid up out of the dark one low-slung bathroom building. 2 vending machines, and a picnic table with a warped top, and I pulled in because my head kept doing that slow nod toward sleep that preludes the trenchcoat figure waiting on the shoulder. I splashed water on my face in the harsh bathroom light, the kind that turns your skin into chalk, and when I stepped back out, I saw her by the cattails past the picnic table, a young woman in a light dress that might once have been white. She wasn't waving yet. She was looking at the road like it was something she used to know how to cross. The air smelled like damp cement and the sugar rot of spilled soda. I told myself she was some college kid out of gas, and I felt a prickle of the older brother guilt that makes you hold your keys a little tighter and look braver than you are. She turned toward me and smiled too quickly, like she'd been practicing alone and finally got to use it. "You okay?" I asked, hearing my own voice sound like it belonged to the building behind me. "Car trouble," she said, and pointed toward the tree line where there was no car. I said I could give her a ride to the next exit, which is what I did. Because sometimes the right thing is the dumb thing and your heart insists on it. She slid into the passenger seat without opening the door, or maybe I was so tired I didn't hear the latch. She smelled like rain on hot dust, a memory of weather. We merged back onto 287, and I tried to make the kind of small talk you use to prove you're not going to hurt somebody. "Where are you headed?" I asked. "Home," she said, like a question. The wind made a long tunnel between the cab and the road. When I checked the mirror, the rest stop was already gone, replaced by miles of black wire and flat fields. I stole glances at her as the yellow lines kept whipping by. She had that look people get in old photographs, eyes that went just past you toward an event you weren't invited to. 20 miles down in the soft orange spill of the Henrietta exit, she put a hand on my arm and asked if I'd mind turning off on a farm road that ran north. My scalp did that cold tightening it does when you can feel the edge of something, but I turned anyway, because there are some requests you honor even when you don't understand them. The farm road was a black ribbon over a bed of crickets. Fences kept appearing and disappearing in the headlights like ribs. She said her father had a porch light that never went out. I was wondering how long it had been burning when she looked down into her lap and smoothed her dress, and I saw the seam of it, a tear stitched with thread that wasn't thread, a fine dark line like someone had tried to sew water. It was then I realized we were driving 30 with the whole night pressing against us and not a single other pair of headlights since we'd turned, and it felt like the windshield had become a screen showing a loop of right now. I was about to ask her if the porch light was blue or yellow when my chest went hollow, the way it does when you realize you've misplaced your wallet and that it means a great deal more than money. The passenger seat was empty. The seatbelt was buckled. The impression of a person's weight was still in the cushion, the heat of a body fogging the glass. The last of her smell dust and rain and something like old perfume that used to be sold at drugstores hung between us and then thinned. I drove until the next town because there is nothing else to do. I told myself I'd imagined it. I told myself a lot of things. When I pulled into a 24-hour diner for coffee, I saw the smear of a handprint on the inside of the passenger window, the kind you get from pressing your fingers there as a kid to watch them fade. I wiped it away. It came back the next morning, faintly, like breath on a mirror. Sometimes now, when I'm on that run after midnight, I'll pass that rest stop and see a pale shape by the cattails, dress moving like water in the wind, and I'll keep going, because I think I finally understand you can't always fix what the road chooses to take. But I still slow down. I still say I'm sorry into the cab, and I listen for the click of a seatbelt that isn't mine. I learned not to stop on I-45 between. Dallas and Houston unless the coffee had run out of me and I was 5 minutes from doing something stupid, because that stretch of interstate has a long memory and a mean one. The night I broke my own rule, I was hauling office furniture and a headache. The sky was a low lid, the kind that hoards light. I took an exit near Huntsville and wound up in a rest area that seemed better maintained than the ones I remembered from childhood. Shiny new stuff, the state's gesture at making people feel safer. There were 2 other cars, both with their lights off, the kind of park that says the driver is pretending to sleep. I climbed out, the air thick and green, the smell of pine and warm plastic. The building was clean, automatic faucets like little halos of blue LED. When I came out, I stood by the picnic tables a while to let the night arrange itself. The trees beyond the floodlights looked like the backs of animals. Somewhere to the southeast was the old killing grounds, the fields where those girls went missing back when the news still called things by names that had edges on them. There's a place south of League City they've named for that, a phrase you say and everyone knows the rest. Past the glow, beyond the trash barrels and the concrete dog run, something moved. I told myself it was a deer. Then it stepped into the light, and it was a woman with hair sticking to her temples as if she'd run a long way. She had the look of highway on her, exhausted, glittering slightly with sweat, a grocery bag gripped so tight her knuckles shone. She asked if she could borrow my phone because hers had died and her boyfriend was late, and she didn't want to go back to the car where he'd left her. The words tumbled out faster than any I'd heard at that hour. She kept glancing toward the tree line like there was a man standing just inside it measuring her. I took my phone out and the screen lit her face. She had a scabbed lip and that thing around the eyes that means a life has turned into the story of surviving it. I asked who to call and she said her sister, and then she said never mind because her sister always made everything worse. When I offered to call the highway patrol, she shook her head so quickly her hair slapped her jaw, and the sound of it in that emptiness felt obscene. I was saying we could wait by my truck where it was bright when she flinched and the grocery bag tore. It wasn't groceries. It was a pair of white sneakers the wrong size and a printed flyer with a girl's face, smiling the way you smile when the photographer tells you one more. And the wrongness of that alone made me feel like I'd stepped sideways. Somewhere behind us a car door thudded shut. She froze. I turned, ready to do something gallant and amateurish, and saw no one in the pool of light, just the building, the vending machines humming like reef fish, the 2 sleeping cars with their fogged windows. The sound had come from the trees, and what came out of them wasn't a man. It was a shadow, tall and uncommitted to its own shape. And for a second I understood the stupidity of thinking a place ends just because the lighting budget does. The woman's hand closed on my sleeve, and for a heartbeat I felt that shake you feel when a thunderhead is directly overhead. Something electric arguing with your bones. We backed toward the truck. I thumbed the key fob and the lights blinked, and the truck beeped cheerfully at a situation no truck was built to interpret. The shadow held back as if the concrete lip of the rest area was a river it didn't want to cross. It seemed to thin in the light, like smoke decentralized, like something that has to borrow darkness to be alive. The woman climbed into the passenger seat without asking and curled herself small, like she knew how not to take up room. We pulled out, the road reabsorbing us with that indifference only highways have. She asked me not to stop until Conroe. I agreed and didn't ask why. By the time we reached a lit exit with a gas station and a bright late-night donut shop, she was asleep with the flyer crumpled in her hand. She woke slowly, as if returning from far away, and got out without looking at me. I said something about calling someone and she told me there was no one to call, and I watched her walk into the donut shop with the gait of someone who'd learned long ago how to pass through rooms without leaving a mark. Weeks later, somewhere on the radio, I heard an officer in a reasonable voice suggest that folks not linger in isolated rest areas, that they stick to busy places, travel in pairs. He didn't say why. He didn't say that sometimes the thing you're afraid of isn't a man you can clock or a field you can avoid. Sometimes it's the scene between the lit part and the unlit part, and how easily you can forget which side you're on. There's a little pull-off on US 281 south of Pleasanton, the kind that exists because once upon a time men with clipboards measured distances between bladders and said, "Here, let's pour some concrete." I stopped there because the day had been long and the road was a vibrating wire in my skull. The sky was doing that Texas thing where it stays hot long after the sun ducks down, as if it's reluctant to let go of the heat it earned. I left the engine running for the air and sat there with the seat tilted back a click, that trance between sleep and alert where the mind starts its private film festival. At first, I thought the lights in my mirror were a car coming up from behind, the friendly geometry of two white eyes. They rose over the crown of the road tall and came on fast, then settled behind me at a distance no sensible driver chooses if he's not planning on passing. I waited for the move left. It didn't come. The lights held where they were, bright enough to put hard edges on the dash. I raised my hand and waved the way you do when you'd like it to be a misunderstanding. The lights pulsed once, a tiny dip like someone's foot tapped the brake, then just hung there, humming with whatever electricity makes light feel like presence. I could make out nothing of a grill, no hood, no silhouette of a cab, just the lights. The hair on my arms rose like it had been told a secret. I put it in drive and rolled forward, the tires whispering gravel that had not been asked to move. The lights matched me. I eased onto the shoulder, figuring maybe he was nervous about passing on a two-lane in the dark. I slowed. The lights slowed. I sped up. The lights came with me, the distance between us exact, like a measurement being, maintained by something that doesn't have to think about math. When I hit 65, the wind tried the seams of the windows and the lights were still there. And I realized there was no sound of another vehicle, no engine note, no rubber. There was only the hiss of my own tires and the little whine my alternator had taken to making and the steady noise you hear when blood runs in your ears because the body thinks you've made a mistake. I cut the headlights off for a beat, a stupid move, but sometimes the night pushes you into gestures. In the split second where my lights died, the road became black and then the world in my mirror did, too, except those two white eyes kept burning, floating in a place where light didn't belong to anything. I snapped my lights back on and something in me went animal, some old part that knows when to stop arguing with evidence. I punched the gas. The truck leapt, the needle climbed, the fences smearing into continuous wire. The lights fell back, a little then lifted higher, like a semi taking a hill, then surged again as if the hill had decided to help. I felt a pressure in the cabin, a compression like someone had sat down on the bed of the truck without opening the tailgate. The wheel tugged left, a whisper that wanted to become a command. I said no out loud, the way you say it to a child who's about to pick up a hot pan. The road unspooled, another pull-off flashed by empty, another and another, and as quickly as they'd come, the lights were gone, not faded. Gone, like a switch had been thrown in a place I couldn't see. I drove another 10 miles before I realized I'd stopped breathing properly. At the next town, I pulled into a lot under sodium lamps that turned everything the color of nicotine and sat with my forehead on the wheel until the world remembered its shape. On the way to the restroom, I passed a man with a face like an old boot who said, unprompted, that his daddy had told him about lights on this road when he was little, how they came up behind you and made you feel like a bug on a pin. I laughed because that's what we do when we are relieved not to be alone in the weirdness, and then he said the part you don't want. Sometimes they know you now. Sometimes they find you again later, at different pull-offs, different towns, like they've learned the geometry of your life. The idea slid in and found a chair. Weeks later, I woke in a motel off 281, the kind with doors that open right onto the parking lot, and saw a glow under the curtain that wasn't dawn and wasn't the sign outside. It was taller and it hummed, with remembered pressure, and I lay there, quiet as a rabbit in static grass, and counted my breaths until the light went out and the day had the decency to start. I took a job that required me to drive between Denton and Oklahoma City twice a week, the kind of commute that makes your phone invent new routes and your brain consume its own tail to stay entertained. There's a rest area north of Denton that everyone used to say was fine during the day and bad news after dark, a picnic loop with magnolia trees that never learned where they were, a set of bathrooms you could smell from the parking lot if the wind found the right angle. One summer afternoon, I stopped on the way back because the heat had the road wobbling, and the world had that watery quality that feels like a fever. The place was more crowded than I liked, families moving briskly along the rule of shade, 2 truckers with shirts untucked like flags after a parade, a woman sitting alone on the low stone wall that separates grass from slope. She had a plastic backpack at her feet and a styrofoam cup with lipstick on the rim, the red kind worn by people who mean it. My plan was to pee, buy a Coke, and get out, nothing heroic. But I walked past and she looked up at me with that expression a lost person uses like a lure. She asked if I knew if the phones worked here because she'd tried one and it ate her quarters and she didn't want to walk back to her car and she didn't want to say why. Her voice had gravel in it, a smoker's music. I offered my phone and she recoiled like I'd held out a snake. I get in trouble when I use other people's, she said, and we let that sit there between us like a choice we were both avoiding. She glanced toward the far end of the lot, beyond the magnolias, where the asphalt turned to a rutted lane that went down into a little copse. There's a picnic table down there nobody uses, she said in a voice that wasn't asking me to follow. I said I'd keep an eye out if she needed anything, and she looked past me with a focus so sharp I could feel the shape of it. That's when I saw the man. He was the kind of man rest areas generate the way old attics generate spiders. Unremarkable, temporarily unshaven, a posture that said he'd been sitting too long. He wasn't looking at her. He wasn't looking at me. He was looking at the lane that disappeared into the trees like a drain. I saw the calculation pass over his face like a cloud, and I hated him immediately because it was familiar. We are better when we are watched. She stood, said thank you for nothing in particular, picked up her backpack, and drifted toward the lane like a leaf taking the only route available to it. The man waited a count of 20 you could set your watch by and then followed, casual as a stretch. I have failed better tests than that one, but something in me wouldn't let this be that again. I took my Coke, warm already, and walked after them, trying to look like someone who'd simply chosen the wrong direction. The lane went lower and the sound from the highway thinned to a hush. The table she'd mentioned sat in a ring of shade, and her backpack was on the bench and her cup next to it, and she was gone. The man wasn't there either, but there was a sound you only notice when you're listening for trouble, a small dry noise like a shoe finding grip on bark. I started to call out, then didn't, because names give power, and I didn't know hers. I cut left across the undergrowth, through the slap of brush and the buzz of insects, and found the place where the land fell away into a little gully that led to a larger one. Down there was the man, bent over, one hand on the root of a tree, peering into the narrow throat of a culvert where water ran in a skin. He wasn't looking for her. He was looking where she'd gone. Some part of me made a noise then, not brave or pretty, just loud enough to make him jerk and look up. In that instant I saw what I'd missed, the way his eyes had no iris to them in that shade, just 2 flat coins that didn't belong to a human face. He came up the slope quick, faster than a man that age should move, and the smell that came with him was old pennies and something left too long in the trunk of a car. I backed straight up the lane with my heart doing karate and felt the sudden relief of sunlight like it was a wall. He stopped just before it, as neat as the end of a leash. His mouth opened and closed twice without a sound. Then he smiled a very careful smile, the kind you practice. and turned back into the trees and dissolved into the shade in a way you can't watch without thinking about endings. By the time I reached my car, she was in the passenger seat. The sun made her look 10 years younger. "Thank you," she said, as if I'd done anything, and asked if I could take her to a gas station at the next exit. We drove without talking. At the station, she slid out and left the door open a second too long. Her backpack was still in my back seat. When I reached for it, the plastic crackled and I smelled dryer sheets and mildew and something else, sweet and rotten, and I set it back down like it had hissed. I looked up and she was gone into the cool cavern of the store. I got out to follow and the heat hit me like a wall, and when I reached the glass door I saw only myself superimposed on racks of chips. I stood there like a man who has mislaid a word. Back at the car, the passenger door was shut. On the seat there was a quarter, old and black with use, showing a year from before I was born. It had a nick in it that made it look like someone had tried to cut something small and hard with it. I drove the rest of the way home without stopping. I still have the quarter, and when I drop it, it never sounds like other coins. It rings like it's falling farther than the floor will allow. I was making a point of driving the old parts of Route 66 because I'd watched a documentary and gotten sentimental, and that kind of sentiment puts people in danger. Near Shamrock, there's a stretch where the road forgets it was once the main artery of a country, where the motels have peeled down to their bones and the gas stations have glass teeth missing. There's an old WPA rest stop out there, stone picnic shelters like little forts. And I pulled over because the sky had gone the color of a bruise and lightning was doing artistic things a long way off. The shelter smelled like dust saved since the 30s and a little like the beer someone had hidden behind the bench. They don't maintain the place. They don't need to. It maintains itself the way old graves do, by insisting. I sat with my feet on the bench, listening to the grasshoppers and the low groan of the wind gathering a plan. The odd thing was the temperature. The air was hot, and then my breath was suddenly visible, like a little white lie in front of my face. I thought of Freon. I thought of Ghost because I'm the kind who laughs at that right up until the laughing stops. Across the road, an old car crouched in the skeleton of a scrubby tree, the kind of two-tone sedan that belonged in a family photo on a mantle you'd sell to an antique dealer without the picture. The front passenger door was open. There were blankets piled in the back, a pillow with a floral case, the kind of domestic mess that makes you think of a couple who couldn't afford a motel and thought the open world was big enough to hide in. The door swung on some whisper of wind that couldn't possibly move it. I told myself it was on a decline. I told myself the latch was shut. Then a voice out of the shelter across from mine said, "Firm as a parent, we should have kept going." And a man answered, "Sleep now," like he was rehearsing being kind. There was no one there. The sound had weight. I stood and the cold moved around me like a coat's hem. You can smell fear when it's your own. It's metallic and you can taste it behind your teeth. I walked to the road with the slow care of someone in a museum near something fragile and valuable, and I looked both ways out of habit because habit is the last religion. The highway was empty enough to hurt. When I crossed, the door shut before I touched it. A small satisfied click, and in the window I saw a woman's face that was nothing but the memory of a face. The way a face looks when a photographer keeps a print in a desk for 30 years. She looked past me, toward the shelters, as if she were expecting herself to come back with coffee and donuts. A smell came up out of the car, then gun oil and cheap perfume and the ghost of something burned, and a tiny dark crust on the upholstery near where a head would rest caught my eye. I don't know why I wanted to talk to them, but I did. Maybe because there is a specific grief reserved for places built for resting that become places where people were finished. I said I'm sorry like it could mean anything. I said I'll sit with you a minute. I heard, in that thin cold air, the smallest sound like someone exhaling after lying to their mother. The lightning got closer in a sheet, not forks. And the edges of the old car lit up like chalk lines on a blackboard, and for a second I saw him, the man, in the driver's seat, jaw clenched, his hand around a gun with the serious concentration of someone following through on a terrible decision. He looked at me like I'd arrived late to a meeting and still wanted to speak. I took a step back without choosing to, and the image winked out like a TV shutting off. On the way to my own car, the air warmed so abruptly it felt like a slap, and the smell of grass came back, and the insects resumed their steady argument. I started my engine with the relief that belongs to machines with keys. At the edge of the pullout, a trooper idled, his window down, the brim of his hat cutting a clean geometry. He asked if I'd seen anything out of the ordinary. I said no, like a coward, and something in his face said he preferred that answer anyway. He told me to be careful in old rest areas because the worst of people collects in the places they were most innocent. When I merged back onto the forgotten road, the storm broke behind me. In the rear view, for a moment, the stone shelters filled, with rain like the sea had rolled a little too far inland. A flash lit the inside of the old car, and I saw the woman again, and this time she looked at me and shook her head once, very slight, as if to say, "Don't stop anymore." I don't dare, not even for photographs. And sometimes when I drive other places, good clean modern places, and I see a family sleeping in their car to save $100, I feel a cold blossom next to me, a breath I can almost see. And I lock my doors the way you lock stories up so they don't follow you home.